Um, don't live in a dichotomy of good and bad. If someone says something that's ignorant, if you automatically make them a bad person, then there's no hope for them, right? And there's no hope for you guys, for the two of you finding that common ground. So when people say stupid things, sometimes they don't mean to. It's based on their limited understanding. So if you live in that world of good and bad, they say something that doesn't please you, so they're a bad person, then we're in trouble there. So give people the benefit of the doubt when they say something that doesn't sit well with you. The next thing to assume is that their intention was good, and then follow with a question. Can you explain a little bit more, right? Can you elaborate?
Welcome to the Empowered Expat Woman Show, the place to celebrate your courage, inspire you to dream and play bigger, and support you in creating a truly fulfilled life across borders. I'm your host, Camila Quintana, and I believe your future is too important to get lost in translation. So, are you ready to make the most of your life abroad? Then let's get started. Hi, my lovely expat woman. It's so great to be back with you. And today I have a truly inspiring, amazing woman who we can learn so much from as my guest. I'm super excited to introduce Martine Kalaw. Did I actually pronounce that right? I didn't ask you.
Camila, you came very, very close. I will accept it. It's Kalaw.
Kalaw.
You were very close.
Good.
I'll take it.
Martine Kalaw, it's such a pleasure to have you. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I will hand over the mic to leave it to you because you have so much to share. You have lived so much across cultures, cross border. Let me just start off by introducing you. A little bio I got in case anyone is not familiar with you. So Martine is or was an undocumented immigrant and stateless survivor. She's a TEDx speaker and published author of the book, The ABCs of Diversity. She appeared before the US Congress to advocate for other immigrants and founded Martine Kalaw Enterprises, which is a firm offering strategy development, implementation, and education to help organizations overcome unconscious bias or unconscious beliefs and implicit bias. She also published her book, Illegal Among Us, A Stateless Woman's Quest for Citizenship. Her memoir recounts Martine's 7-year battle of deportation to the Democratic Republic of Congo and beating an immigration court system that was designed for her to fail. It's already published and available in hard copy. Did you hold it up? Did you show it?
Oh.
This is what it looks like, people. So please go out, I guess, Amazon and all other, right? That's where you can get it. I'm also going to put the link in the show notes. So do check that out. Summer literature, we all need it. And this sounds so promising. Now, Martine, over to you. Tell us a little bit about your truly adventurous journey.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Camila. Thank you for having me. I like to, start off by explaining or introducing myself as who I am right now and today. And that's truly what you said in my bio. I run a boutique firm that supports organizations, global organizations, in implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's often seen as an extra thing that they have to do, and it's heavy and it's burdensome to especially human resources professionals. So I support organizations in doing that, and I do speaking events and so forth. But the reason I do this is I was actually thinking back to when my journey of being an immigrant, an undocumented immigrant, and a stateless person connected with DEI. And it was when I was in university and college, and I was doing, for my senior thesis, I did a study to look at assimilation and acculturation across 2 refugee groups, Black Sudanese refugees and white Bosnian refugees in a local community that I was in, because they both happened to be Muslim. So there was a constant there. And I wanted to understand how easy is the assimilation process of these 2 groups that have been brought in as refugees after basically genocide in both of their countries. And I was able to go into their homes of many of these individuals from these communities and learn. And that's when I experienced so much in understanding that there is lots of bias. Sometimes it's not just bias. It's more than that. It's a xenophobia, it's racism, it's bigotry, it's all of that that is embedded in the immigration system in the US, I'll say, right? But we also know that what we've seen is that it's embedded in a lot of systems across the globe. We can look at the news today and just kind of look at how refugees are positioned in the news, in the media, versus expats and so forth. So that is a little bit about, that connection. And I do the work I do in DEI because I want to be the bridge builder between the people who have access to, who have access to things, and those who don't. And I want those who do have access to see that these other people aren't charity. They don't need help. They need to be invested in. And the reason that's so important to me is because I was one of those people who didn't have, but I knew that if someone could just see my potential and invest in me, not see me as charity, not see me as help, but truly invest in me, I promised them, like I would show them. And that came from, I'm working backwards here. That came from my journey of, I was born in Zambia. I came to the US when I was 4 years old with my mother. And it was quite an interesting journey. My mom was escaping my father, who was quite abusive to her, came to the US where the rest of her family was to pursue the American dream. She remarried to an American. By the time I was 13, my stepfather, who was my father, passed away. And then it seemed like shortly thereafter, within a year and a half, my mom passed away. So I became orphaned at that age. And what I didn't know was that I fell out of status because my mother and I came on visitors' visas to the US, and I overstayed my visa. She was able to apply for a permanent residency through her husband, my stepfather. And at the time that she died, she was actually in the process of applying for US citizenship. And so, and my mother and my biological father, I should say, are from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They were born there. So I became undocumented and stateless in the moment that my mother had passed away, and my stepfather. I did not know that because I was trying to survive. And I was tossed from one home to another, my mother's side of the family, and were experienced unfortunate circumstances, to say it nicely. And I just knew I had that determination, though, that in my mind, I always believed in something bigger. My favorite book is Alice in Wonderland, The Mad Hatter, because I was that daydreamer. I would always daydream all the things I could be, and I wanted to be, and going to New York City and being a businesswoman, wearing my heels and my, briefcase. I mean, this is what I always saw. And I think I had that image embedded in my head. And so I kept thinking, this can't be all there is to life. And so I willed others to see my potential, put myself through boarding school, college, and graduate school. And it was in my college experience when I learned that I was truly undocumented and stateless, because I was placed in deportation proceedings and spent 7 years of my life, being in this court system that was determined to, and I'll say the immigration judge was determined to annihilate me because he did not like people like me and what I represented.
So would
Yes.
it be true to say that while you were a minor and you
Yeah.
were already living in the States, they allowed you to stay, quote unquote, and then when you became a grown-up officially, that's when they saw their chance to try and send you away? Is that?
Yeah, I would say, just to, be more clear and, from a legal standpoint, I overstayed my visa at some point. My mother, who was my parent and guardian, my stepfather, they were ignorant about it. I think they thought because from the time I was 4 years old, I grew up in the US, US school systems is where I was a product of. I speak English. I don't really have an accent. I think there was a level of ignorance from them about how to and whether to adjust my status. And
Right.
my mom's priority was saving her children in Congo, like that were living there in a war-torn country. She wanted to bring them here to the US because I was already here. So when she died, that, you know, that status that I had, that visa that was attached to her, right? Because I came on her passport, it was null and void. And
Right.
apparently what I learned was that I had a short period of time following my mother's death to adjust my own status. I did not
You
know
were
that.
tiny,
How
of
would I have
course.
known?
How would you have known?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was 15 years old. I was literally trying to survive. Like, where am I going to sleep? How am I going to eat? You know, that was my reality and that was my focus. The last thing on my mind was, I didn't even know that I was
Of
undocumented. I
course.
didn't even know I was stateless, you know. And I found out that I was stateless when the courts were trying to deport me, right? And it was post 9/11. It was right after, during 9/11. And I felt like a fugitive, right? I couldn't get on, you know, I didn't have identity, so I couldn't get on the bus, I couldn't get on the train, I couldn't fly anywhere, I couldn't go anywhere. I never owned a passport because I came on my mother's passport. And when the courts were trying to deport me, there was no country that would accept me, not my birth country of Zambia, not my mother and my biological birth country of Democratic Republic of the Congo. The US didn't want me, and there was no third country that would also accept me. And so that therein lie the problem, right? And unfortunately, there are, you know, according to the United Nations, there are over 12 million stateless people in the world today.
Right.
That
I
number
was just going to
continues to
ask you, how
increase.
common is that? And I think
Very, very,
so
very,
many
very.
of us are pretty oblivious to
Yes,
this very particular scenario, which
very.
sounds completely absurd, to be honest. How can
Yeah.
a person be
Not have a
stateless and not
country.
be accepted by any state? It sounds
Absolutely.
so absurd, but I cannot believe. Did you say 12? That
12 million, 12 million.
12
Every
million.
10 minutes, a stateless child is born. So people become stateless through a myriad of ways. One is if they're displaced because of their country, you know, being war torn, or you think of climate change, and you know, and that's a, you know, it's
Yeah.
becoming a prevalent issue. It's also some countries you can be born there, but you don't have birthright citizenship. The
Right.
United States is one of the few countries.
Yeah.
Some are patrilineal, some are, they're laws that are created to prevent people who are born there from actually claiming citizenship. I know someone who actually was born in France, who happened to be, you know, his family, his ethnicity is Chinese descent. He's stateless, right? He France did not allow him, even though he was born there, he doesn't have birthright citizenship, and
Mhm.
came to the US. You know, he lives in the US, but you know, is in that situation. There are a lot of Haitians who are stateless as well. I'm just giving some examples to
Yeah.
give people context of how
Yeah.
common this is. There are a lot of Haitians who were born in Dominican Republic, and but the Dominican Republic changed its laws saying, predating back to 1942, if your ethnicity is of Haitian descent, all the way predating back to 1942, even if your mother, your grandmother, your great grandmother were all born in Dominican Republic, none of them are considered citizens, neither are you. So can you imagine? It would be like, you
Incredible.
know, you being from Spain, and someone saying, okay, predating back to the 1900s, you know, if your family was from some other country before the 1900s, you're no longer considered a Spanish citizen, you know.
Yeah.
Now what are you?
Yeah.
You know where to go. This is very common. It's common in, you know, just so many parts of the world. And it's, you know, and that's why the image of my book is the way that it is, because when you're undocumented or when you're a refugee, you feel like a prisoner, right? And that's usually the analogy. But when you're stateless, you almost feel like you're in the shadows within a prison, because there's no recourse for people like myself. And thankfully, I am now a US citizen. I was able to navigate through a broken court system, but it's very uncommon for someone who came from my background to be where I am today.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, this is such a touching story. And I'm so glad that, first of all, we're having this conversation here so that you can really shed light onto this,
Thank
which
you.
I believe is something that, first of all, it's not as documented, let's say, in the media. It doesn't
Right.
get as much airtime as certain other stories, right?
Right.
And maybe it's also something where people prefer to look away because it's really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes, unfortunately, right, it's easier for people to look away and not even go there.
You know what, Camila, that I love that you're saying that. I'm part of an organization called United Stateless, and we actually have, convenings, and we're also part of affiliated with a lot of stateless organizations globally, right? And one of the things that occurred to me that was shared was that most times, not most times, actually all the time, statelessness occurs because of discrimination in
Mm,
any part of the world. And so exactly what you're saying, by acknowledging the media and countries acknowledging it, they're also acknowledging the discriminatory practices they have
right.
to sort towards certain ethnic groups. And right, it's a way to exclude people, saying, even if you were born here, even if you've lived here and you were born here, we found a way, we're creating a loophole so that we cannot have you associated with us. And no one wants that mirror put up to their face. So
Yeah.
it's better to just
Yeah.
turn it away.
You're
And also
so
because
right.
there's no legal recourse. Another important information I'll share with you is that because there's no legal recourse in the world, really, for stateless persons, they're more likely to be the subject of human trafficking, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because there are no
Yeah.
laws for stateless people.
They don't have a passport, so they have
They don't
nowhere
have,
to go. Yeah.
they have no path,
Yeah.
not just a passport, right? Because
Right.
undocumented people and sometimes don't have a passport, but when you are stateless, you don't have a country. You can't claim a passport. No country acknowledges you. So
Yeah.
literally you have no laws. There are no laws to protect you. There's no one
Yeah.
that can actually stand up for you and say, no, you are a human being. You deserve to be treated with dignity, you know?
Right. And ladies, when we started our conversation, well, just when we hopped on this call, one of the first things I mentioned is that my sister, she lives in Australia. She has an EU passport, which is a strong passport, but Australia is also has very strict immigration laws. And
Very
so she's currently in this limbo, like, will I get sponsored again? Will I be able to stay or not? And I was just sharing with Martine that as a European citizen living between European countries, I it's such a privilege because I don't even have to think about this. I can just go and live literally between different countries, and I don't have to worry about visas, and I don't have to worry about these kind of things, right? It's more like the emotional component, but
right,
not
right.
the legal one. And I think that's why it's especially important to hear the reality of not just 12 million of stateless, but also of immigrants, who have a really hard time staying in the country that they call their home, and they're not allowed to stay there any longer, for instance. So,
Right.
just to tie this up, to say, we cannot look away. It does concern us all. It's uncomfortable, and that's exactly why we have to look there and move through it. And while you were sharing, I was thinking about back when George Floyd's murder and the outrages, and there was this term white fragility that came up. Up until that point, I'm not an American, so I hadn't really heard of that, and it was so interesting though to me. And I actually even shared a social media post on that, and I called it expat fragility. And
Mm,
this goes into my next question now, to analyze a little bit in your definition, the difference between expat and immigrant. How do they feel different? How are they perceived differently? Because for
yeah,
me, I
yeah,
will admit, in my process of just diving into this topic, I do agree, I do admit that I go with an attitude of, well, I should be welcome here. And if I'm not, I'm, I might be a little upset, and I might not understand, like, why don't you welcome me with open arms? And
that's right.
that's exactly
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. That's exactly this
Yes.
white fragility or expat fragility, where
Yeah.
you go into a different place with a certain expectation that I think everyone should have and it should be granted. But maybe can you first of all share expat immigrant? What are your thoughts about these two terms?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that there are actually definitions on, and if we open up Wikipedia, there are some definitions, and an expat is, I think, someone who's a foreign worker, who's coming as a student or for employment purposes, typically to another country for shorten a specific period of time. Whereas an immigrant is someone who, and there's like the E with immigrant, there's the I immigrant, right? There's a migrant who's coming, to do work also, but at a different level or different category, right? It's everything is categorized and bucketed. Migrants are usually doing work that is, it's oftentimes some, considered like blue collar work, right? So that's one category. An immigrant is someone who is traveling, right, to another country for a shortened period of time usually the intention is sometimes, I think, to stay for a certain period of time and maybe adjust their status. So those are like the actual definitions. I don't believe that the average person is really thinking about, okay, what is this? What is the actual term and definition when they're defining someone? It truly comes down to perception, right? And that really ties back to, diversity, equity, and inclusion in that conversation. We include people based on our perception of who they are and their likeness and closeness to us, right? And so the same thing with, expat versus immigrant. The perception oftentimes has to do with what a person looks like and our judgment of how close they are in proximity to us, right? In terms of how familiar we are and what they sound like. And sometimes it's tied to socioeconomic status. I mean, we do this all the time anyway when we make friends and identify people. Sometimes it's an unconscious bias, sometimes it's conscious, but it's there in the back of our minds, right? And so I have seen how even myself, I love that you talk about this, white fragility. I think her name is Barbara D'Angelo, something D'Angelo. I have her book. It's a really interesting read. But I also acknowledge the privilege I have because even as a stateless person and undocumented immigrant, oftentimes I believe that people thought I was an expat, right? And a lot of times it's because of the way I sound. I open my mouth and people go, oh, you sound, and I actually have had people say, you don't sound like the rest of them. I actually had someone say that who knew that I was undocumented. And we can fill in the blanks to figure out what they mean by the rest of them, right? But you sound educated, Martine. So therefore, you don't sound like an immigrant. You sound like an expat who's supposed to be educated, coming here, be a student. And so that's the general perception that I think all people have, many of us have, across different parts of the world. And it is tied to what we look like, our skin tone, our skin color. It also is tied to what we sound like. It's tied to our socioeconomic status and our education level. And that is how I believe people bucket it. And it's so interesting to me when I travel the world because, and now that I have that privilege, when I go to Dubai and the perception that people have of me, depending on who I am, where I am, and who I'm associated with, right? I have an Emirati, one of my good friends is Emirati. When I'm with her, I can see how people see me versus when I open my mouth, their definition shifts some more. And then based on my proximity to her, shifts more, right? When I was in South Africa, I also saw how people saw me. They were trying to bucket me. Well, what is she? Is she an expat? What is she? Is she an immigrant? Is she a refugee, right? And all of those labels people have tiers for those labels, right? They create this this continuum of what's best and worst. Let's be
Yes.
honest.
They
And
want to be able to categorize us and put us in a box so that they
yes,
know what to think of us, and just
that's right.
simplify the whole
Yeah.
process, right?
And it's much more common in America, I would say, than anywhere else in the world. This is what I'll say. I'll say in America, it's much more overt. Americans generally have a tendency to want to put people in boxes, right? Because that's what we do. We have senses and we do that. Whereas in other parts of the world, identity is a little bit more fluid. It's tied more to nationality. Like you said, you have an EU passport, like, or, access to the EU. People aren't, oh, are you Spanish? Are you this? Not so much as in the US. Are you Black? Are you white? What are you? Right. However, in other parts of the world, my observation is that there's an unspoken understanding of where you fall. What's your class? What's your position? And that's just understood, and no one makes a big deal out of it. Whereas in the US, they insist on knowing. They want to know what you think you are. They also want to see if it aligns with what they think you are. What they think you are is always going to supersede what you think, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
Yeah.
And, talking about how others perceive us and how we are made feel by others looking at us one way or another, which in the case of the expat experience, it can really vary wherever we go, right? There are some countries where we will be very welcomed, and then other countries where people will have a negative stereotype or some bias, right? And I think there is something really intrinsic in human people, or in humans, and especially in women, where we want to fit in and belong. This could also be very much conditioning so that we could be safe, right, and protected by a group, and just know that we belong to that group. And I feel like for an expat, it's this constant dilemma of navigating this tension between wanting to fit in and wanting to belong, and on the other hand, also knowing that you are different, owning your difference, standing up for diversity, which thankfully now we know, or many nowadays know, that it is indeed important and valuable, not just to companies, but to the social dialogue, right?
Yeah.
What is your advice for women who are in this dilemma, right? Of how much should I hold on to who I am, and how much can I let go and open up to new ways of being?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, because well, one, the term intersectionality comes up, a lot. Intersectionality means sitting at the cusp of multiple identities, ultimately. And this is a time where we should embrace intersectionality. Like, if I asked you, how do you define yourself? You might say woman first, and you might then say, mother second, or you might say mother first. And that's your choice. And you can shift in however you want, depending on, what time of day it is. But like I said, in certain cultures and societies, it's really hard for people to allow you to be part of multiple groups and categories. And when we talk about inclusion, right? When I work with companies and I say, when you talk about inclusion, what do you mean? Do you mean multiculturalism, or do you mean assimilation? Do you want everyone to be like one type of person, a certain, when we say it's a great culture here, are we saying that we want everyone to be exactly the same in a certain way, or do you want multiculturalism? So it's really important to break that down. I do think that our tendency, again, as human beings, is to want to belong, right? And to want to adjust ourselves in order to belong. My answer to it is, do it as much as it feels comfortable without losing yourself. And again, that terminology of intersectionality comes in. You're going to be in spaces and places where people are uncomfortable with you saying, I'm this and that, or I embrace all of these things, because they're just not used to that, right? They're used to one identifier, because that's how their limitations, or that they see the world as limited in that way. But what you get to do is teach them something different. No, I embrace this and I embrace that. I'm this and I'm that. And you get to define what that looks like. And it's going to look different from one person to another. I learned that the hard way. for many years, and I talk about this in my memoir, I tried so hard to prove that I was American because obviously, for legal reasons, I wanted America to want me and to prove that this was my home. So
Yeah.
I rejected anything that wasn't American. I am not African. I'm not Congolese. Like, those are the things that I pushed away, the culture and all of that, to prove that I was American enough to be in
Yeah.
America. But now I'm at a place where I I can say I'm American, I'm Congolese, and I'm Zambian. And people are like, what is that? You can't be all those. Pick one. No, I'm not picking one. Those are all of my identities, and I have more, and that is okay. And I'm a global citizen. That's another identity that I have. So that would be my advice to every woman who is experiencing this sort of identity crisis of, who am I? Be who you want to be, and don't try to fit into somebody else's definition, because usually their definition is going to be much more limited to their experiences.
Yeah. And I want to pick up on that topic and just go a little deeper here. How do you usually teach people who are not aware of the asset that it is to be a multicultural or of a diverse background and
Yeah.
just unique, right? Simply unique and not adapted to what everyone else maybe looks like. How do
Yeah.
you teach people, or how do you help open their eyes to how enriching that is? I'm thinking both in the professional world, for someone maybe going to a job interview and encountering a very closed or right culture there, but also in the personal space where maybe for instance, a lot of my clients, they married someone from a different country, moved to that country. Now they are not from that country, but they feel a lot of pressure, maybe by their spouse, maybe by their in-laws, maybe by the society culture, to be more like them. So are there some tips how we can communicate that no, we do not all need to be the same, right? This is
Not to
actually,
adjust to who you are. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just finding that human connection, right? At the end of the day, I always think, and I always say, we all came from a mother, right? We all love our mothers. Like, that's that common denominator, right? And we all want to make sure that it's kind of like a concept that comes from negotiation practices, right? Our positions might be different, right, in terms of our positions in life, but our purpose, our mission in life is usually the same. We all want to take care of our family. We all want a home. We all want to make sure our families have food to eat. We all came from a mother that we love. We all love our mothers, right? Most of us, generally speaking, right?
yeah,
And so ultimately, that's just an illustration of the point that I'm trying to make is connect to people from that human level,
yeah,
show them and illustrate to them. Now they have to be willing. And so there are times where, you're going to have people who have ignorance because based on their limited perception. So the tools that I use, whether it's in the workplace, professionally, or personally, is to remind people that, one, don't live in a dichotomy of good and bad. If someone says something that's ignorant, if you automatically make them a bad person, then there's no hope for them, right? And
yeah,
there's no hope for you guys, for the two of you finding that common ground. So when people say stupid things, sometimes they don't mean to. It's based on their limited understanding. So if you live in that world of good and bad, they say something that doesn't please you, so they're a bad person, then we're in trouble there. So give people the benefit of the doubt when they say something that doesn't sit well with you. The next thing to assume is that their intention was good, and then follow with a question. Can you explain a little bit more, right? Can you elaborate? So that is like one of the first things that I recommend for anyone to do, to have that level of patience.
yeah,
Oh, it's not easy, but if you assume that people mostly are coming from a good place, then when they say something that's ignorant, like, oh, I didn't know that, you're so nice for a Black woman. I have people say that you're so
me
pleasant.
too.
I always thought Black women were angry. I could really like that could really offend me, because that is incredibly, it's a trope, it's offensive, but I can stop and go, all right, and it's my choice. Do I want to deal with this now And do I feel like do I think this person's really trying to be mean spirited, or are they saying something based on like their what they've seen and the stories they've seen about Black women? So
Yeah.
that is the very first thing I would say. And then secondly is then ask permission to ask questions, right? When you're wanting to educate someone, you want to ask, hey, is this a good time? I want to just kind of ask you some clarifying questions just to understand where you're coming from, because that comment doesn't really sit right with me or whatever, and ask, because I've had people all the time, anywhere I go in the world, people always ask me, where are you from? And I used to be so offended by that, especially in the US, because I thought, I'm American. What do you mean? I like try to prove that I'm American and I'm
Yeah.
here. I speak English. Why do you keep asking? And it's because people would say, no, it's because your mannerisms are not like what I would normally associate with an American. The way you speak English, it's just, you don't have a clear accent like you're from New York or anywhere. And I go, oh, that's why they're asking.
Right.
So it's not meant to be offensive. So ask those clarifying questions,
Yeah.
ladies and
And
gentlemen.
I think sometimes people are also a little clumsy, and by
Yes,
asking them to explain, please,
that's
what they
right.
meant, they probably notice themselves, oh, wait, I probably said something that wasn't the case.
Right.
And
And it
also
should
something that I
direct that.
notice, yeah, something that I notice, moving between different countries and meeting people from different nationalities, um, there are different degrees of, for instance, political correctness or different ways of expressing themselves. And it's very interesting to notice that, okay, well, in this culture, they use some terms that
Yeah.
translated into another language, it would be an absolute no-go to use that term, for instance,
Right.
right? So
You're right.
just to add this cultural context, sometimes we can be gracious and say, oh, I don't know, is this still, is this terminology how you would refer to, let's say,
How
people
would
of
you
this
define
ethnicity?
yourself?
Is
Yes.
this right? Is this how in your
Yes.
country it is expressed? Because it's not in
Well,
mine.
and even Camilla, when we're talking about, I love you bringing up cultural competency, because even within a society, a culture, it varies from person to person.
Mm,
Some people wouldn't know whether I define myself as African American, because that's a term used for anyone who oftentimes who have my skin color, or do I prefer to be referred to as Black or African, right? That could vary. And of course, from country to country, that varies. The term African American wouldn't apply if I were in Ghana, or maybe it would, right? And so it's okay for people. I always encourage people to ask permission to ask questions. May I ask you a question? I
right.
actually don't know, like, how do I refer to you? How do you want to be defined in terms of your race and ethnicity? I just don't know. And that's it. And then
Yeah.
have the person tell you, because you might meet another Black woman who looks exactly like me and says, I like to be referred to as African American. So it really does vary from person to person, not just culture. There are cultural nuances, but it does become individual. So when I facilitate DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, what I say is we're all going to make mistakes. We are, because there isn't one universal term for each group or category of people that's going to sit well with everybody in that
Right.
group. And so we just have to ask this question. So going back to your original question, we don't want to put people in a good bad dichotomy.
Yeah.
Ask permission to ask questions, right? And also make sure that you feel safe, right? That's also
Right.
another thing. It's okay to be in discomfort, but when you feel unsafe, that is not the best time. If you feel like your safety is at odds, then that's when you want to remove yourself from the
Yeah.
situation and take a pause. And I think it's also important to remind women and men alike that safety is an important component of this as well, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah. I love this approach, and I love how it's so it's so gracious, right? To just ask questions. And I feel like it's a much more powerful approach, most probably, than trying to convince someone
yeah,
of your point of view or why they're wrong or so forth. Because usually, and that's, also going back to what you said, find the commonalities.
Yeah.
If we really do want to change a person's mind or open them up to a different viewpoint, this is, it sometimes feels, I think, unjust that you have to bring up this patience and endure maybe an uncomfortable conversation just to make them see what they should maybe clearly see.
Yeah.
I do believe it's the most sustainable approach.
And I learned that, I know we're going to move on to the next point, but I just wanted to say two things. One is you're absolutely right, because we're all in a continuum to learn, right?
Mm,
No one knows all and knows everything about diversity. We're all in a continuum. Two is I learned this best from my journey of being stateless and undocumented. When I was speaking on Capitol Hill in front of Congress, and I was appealing to individuals to invest in, so I can get private scholarship to go to a university. You can't force people or tell people that you deserve something. You have to show them. You have to show them who they are, who you are, and let them come to reach their own understanding. That is the best way to convince someone, not through force, right? And I think anybody who specializes in sales knows this. You don't, to be a good
right.
salesperson, you're not trying to like force someone to buy something. You listen, you ask questions, you get them to build trust. So then they start to see you as a human being, and then they let down their guard. And then, that's when the relationship starts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is so valuable. Now, a question I ask all of my guests is, what does being an empowered expat woman mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. It means being vulnerable.
Mm,
That's what it means. It means empowerment. Certainly means having agency. It means being strong. But I think that sometimes we overuse that term of being strong, and it means that we can't cry. We can't show our weakness, our vulnerability. We can't say that we're struggling. We have fears. Things aren't working. I think that's, I think especially as women, generally speaking, we try to overcompensate, right, to move against those stereotypes that we know that people have about women, right, by being super strong, by being all of these things, like really taking on, owning strength, and not allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. I think it's okay to, again, be in that intersection of strength. Empowerment means being weak and strong at the same time. It means
yeah.
having moments where it's hard and you say, like, it's actually really hard. And then illustrating to everyone that is observing you how you're moving beyond the difficulties of life.
Yes.
That's what it means, So I'm an empowered woman because, when I went through my immigration challenges, it wasn't that I was, I was fearless and I didn't, and I pushed through. It's because I broke down, but I had my community to lift me up when I couldn't lift myself up, right? I didn't always have the faith, but I had people who had faith for me. And so I think it's okay to give each other permission to be vulnerable, to be weak in moments and get back up. That's what it means to be empowered in my book. And when we do that, we restore our dignity, right? Because we're not working against or towards like this idea, a perfect image of who we're supposed to be. So it restores our dignity and it amplifies our voice.
Yeah, I love that. And I think earlier in our conversation, you said something about, it was about finding this path between adapting and owning who you are. And you
Yeah.
said something about redefining what a certain identity means to you.
Yes.
And now I'm thinking, and this is redefining what strength, for instance, means, because strength
Right.
can indeed mean being vulnerable. That is really
Right.
strong. That is
Yeah.
probably much stronger than faking it and looking strong and tough and right. So
Right.
yeah, I'm a big fan of redefining, and I think it's a concept that applies to so many different areas of our life,
Yeah.
and also really fits in beautifully in this conversation, which was
Yeah.
so inspiring. Thank you so much, Martine. I would love to just chat on with you.
Yes, me too.
But I feel like this conversation needs to come to an end now,
Yeah, it does.
unfortunately.
For the
But
listeners.
yes, but listeners, I'm sure you would love to continue this conversation also, and there are many different ways that you can do that. So can you tell us, Martine, how can people find out more about you, follow you, work with you? Well, we
Yeah.
already talked about your books. Please tell us.
Yes, I will keep it simple and say that if you go to my website, martinekalaw.com, you will be able to access, my books if you're interested in learning more about my books, and also links to my immigration website so you can learn about the work that I do around statelessness, undocumented immigration, any speaking engagements that I have coming up. All of those things are available just by going to my website, martinekalaw.com. And it's also will give you access to my social media handles and so forth.
Great. Thank you so much, Martine. It was amazing having you.
Thank you.
And yes, all of you ladies, I wish you a lovely day, evening, wherever you are. Take
Yes.
as much of the goodies as you can of this conversation and apply them to your own life, and redefine where it feels like you need to redefine some things, right? About your identity, about maybe how involved you want to get in helping diversity and refugees and stateless, undocumented people and so forth. So definitely lots of food for thought. Thank you again. And I see you all very soon. Bye.
Bye.